Welcome to the Machon Shilo channel, Yehonatan Pollard.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Very happy to have you. May your message of painful truth awaken those who need to be awakened and help advance us towards Jewish victory. Rabbi Bar-Hayim.
Shalom. Thank you very much. It's once again a pleasure to meet up, at least digitally, with our friend, with a great Jew, Jonathan Pollard. And today we shall begin by discussing certain concepts which are bandied about all the time, particularly with reference to Israel. But really, if they apply to Israel, they should apply, so you would think. I'm referring to issues such as collateral damage, civilian populations. What is a civilian? When does a civilian population, when should it, if at all, have a special status, a different status? This has everything to do with the Geneva Conventions, when they came into being, why they came into being, various decisions by the International Court in The Hague, etc., etc. We could discuss these things for hours and days, but we'll, as always, we'll try to limit ourselves according to the forum and the constraints with which we must work. So, Jonathan, what are your thoughts about collateral damage when fighting an enemy which resides among and deliberately surrounds themselves with people who are referred to, and this is part of the question, as innocent civilians? Are they in fact innocent civilians? And how should we conduct ourselves?
A lot of the concepts dealing with collateral damage and innocent civilians could actually be traced back to the Peace of Westphalia back in, I think it was 1648, which terminated the religious wars between the Protestants and the Roman Catholics in mostly in Central Europe. The carnage, the pain, and the slaughter that had occurred to the civilian population during the 30 Years' War was so great that people at that point started thinking very seriously about the issues of collateral damage and the protected status of innocent civilians. At that point, the laws were more or less respected in the breach more than they were in reality, particularly when it came to sieges. Sieges of cities always revolved down to massive civilian deaths. When a breach in a wall had been achieved by the besieging force would give the besieged an opportunity to escape the slaughter by surrendering. If they did, well and good. If they didn't, then a general slaughter would ensue. So there was the rule of war versus a more humanitarian view of innocence. So it was qualified. They were given a chance to have a protected status once the wall had been breached. But after that, if they refused to surrender, they lost whatever privilege they had. The Geneva and Hague Conventions really dealt with combatants and the rules of war. And there, the rules of war were shaped to a very large extent by what happened during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. What happened then was the creation of what the French were called the Franc-Tireurs. They were guerrilla forces. After the French army the regular army had been destroyed at Sedan and at Strasbourg. And the Germans responded, well, as the Germans always respond, with an extremely heavy hand. And it wasn't just impromptu execution of these individuals that were not fighting in uniform, but for the cities themselves, these were reprisals that the Germans really started up. The Frankführer, the guerrillas, were targeting the German supply columns. Germans had never experienced, really nobody had experienced things like this before. And the Germans responded with a very, very heavy hand, not just against the guerrillas that were caught, who were immediately executed, but against the harboring towns and villages. And examples were made, even for those villages and towns that had absolutely nothing to do with the support of the guerrillas. Later, and it was understood in the rules of war at that time, that the notion of an illegal combatant and those people supporting them. An illegal combatant, under those rules, could be executed on the field of battle by anybody. And as far as reprisals are concerned, as long as they were proportional, there's a loaded word, but as long as they were proportional, people more or less looked the other way. Things really came to a head during the Second World War. The First World War, the fighting was mostly at the front. And again, you had reprisals, but they were mostly in Belgium by the German army against what they perceived to be guerrillas. Well, in the Second World War, you had two instances where war was committed exclusively against civilian populations by the Allies, believe it or not. In the first instance, by Bomber Command, the RAF's Bomber Command, and their philosophy of area bombing of cities was due to revenge, first of all, but second of all, their bombing accuracy was very, very bad at the beginning of the war. They couldn't pinpoint hit targets. So Arthur Harris, Bomber Harris, as he was affectionately known as, came up with an idea of hitting cities or area bombing in order to dehouse the worker population. So there were no innocent Germans living in urban areas that had industry. They were considered war workers. Different term, a different concept. What about the women? What about the children? It didn't matter. The fact of the matter was the men had to be what the British called dehoused in order to make them look for housing, literally. And so it would more or less run their strength down. It would demoralize them, more or less. And the bombing was, you had bombing campaigns involving 1,000 bombers. Operation Gomorrah.
Right. 1,000 bomber raids.
1,000 bomber raids. Well, at night, you're not too accurate with those, but that wasn't the point. The point was civilians had now been, innocent, quote, civilians had now been redefined as members of the war economy. Likewise, in the Pacific, you had the 20th Air Force, mostly B-29s, and their targets were Japanese cities. General Curtis E. LeMay came up with the idea of firebombing Japanese cities. Why? Was it revenge? Some people thought it was motivated by revenge, but here too, they had a rationalization. And what was that? It was that the Japanese military industry had, to a very large extent, decentralized. And so it was made up, in many instances, of cottage industries spread throughout very flammable cities. So Curtis E. LeMay kind of wrapped his revenge around this notion of attacking and destroying Japan's decentralized military-industrial complex. And so on the first bombing raid, firebombing raid, close to 100,000 Japanese civilians died, a gruesome death. There were more people died on that first bombing raid than Hiroshima and Nagasaki put together. It was horrific. And once they realized how devastating it was on the Japanese economy and morale, then this excuse or rationalization for targeting civilians took off. There was opposition, both in Britain and in the United States to a certain extent, against this, because people were saying, you're drawing a distinction between ourselves and the enemy, but in practice, there is no distinction. This is why, for example, Bomber Command in England never had a separate medal. They never did. There was never a monument put up to them, and their casualties were horrendous. And it was only until much, much, much later that a statue finally went up to Arthur Harris. So there was unease.
The famous Bomber Harris.
Yeah, Bomber Harris. So there was unease a little bit during, but certainly after, because of the lack of distinction between what the Allies were doing and what the Nazis and the Japanese had done.
Let me just ask you a question at this point. In your estimation, what was the contribution of the carpet bombing campaigns in Germany and in Japan to the eventual victory?
Okay. There were arguments at the time. Let's just restrict this to the European theater. There were arguments at the time that the bomber fleets, both the RAF and the 8th Air Force, American 8th Air Force, should have expended their resources, human and capital resources, against strategic targets, the normal strategic targets like industrial facilities, power plants, and the like. The fact of the matter is, at Schweinfurt, the 8th Air Force tried to have a pinpoint bomber raid against a major Luftwaffe German aircraft production facility, and they were slaughtered. And it wasn't until accompanying aircraft, long-range aircraft like the P-51 Lightning came about that allowed the bomber fleets, the American bomber fleets at least, that conducted daylight bombing to get through to their targets, specific targets. How accurate were they? Well, let's skip that for the moment, but they were more accurate than carpet bombing. The British held to carpet bombing. There was a plan to keep the bombing campaign going for 24 hours. How effective was it? The Germans had to defend their cities and their industrial facilities with whatever resources they could. And if you look at the amount of resources that were devoted to air defense and rebuilding, it contributed significantly to the outcome of the war. Why? Because all of those resources, both in terms of air defense and rebuilding, would otherwise have been used on the battlefield. And when you look at the numbers of anti-aircraft guns, particularly the fearsome 88 millimeter, if any more of them had been on the battlefield, the butcher's bill for the Allied armored forces would have been horrific. So that's one way of looking at how the bomber campaign in general and how the area bombing in specific affected the Germans. In Hamburg, which was really hammered during one campaign, it did bring to a halt German industrial production in and around Hamburg because of the fire storms that were created by the firebombing. It was so bad that Goebbels and others basically told Hitler, if this continues, and Albert Speer told Hitler this also, if this bombing campaign continues, and that meant the area bombing and the specific bombing that the 8th Air Force committed, if this continues, we're going to lose the war because our workers will be demoralized, and there's no place for them to live. And our logistics facilities inside Germany, particularly the rail system, is going to be knocked out. And actually, it was the attack on the rail system towards the end of the war that spelled the end for Nazi Germany in terms of the bombing campaign. As far as the numbers of people who were killed, well, it was an attack on the army's manpower pool, because the cities where most of the manpower was located for the Wehrmacht. So when you start having area bombing campaigns that were producing 9, 10, 15,000, 20,000 dead a night, it had a demoralizing effect, first of all, on the soldiers at the front, the front Soldaten, because their families were getting blown to pieces. And second of all, it was really killing a lot of reducing the manpower pool. So I would say that the area, because pinpoint bombing wasn't as developed as it is now, the British in particular had no other choice before the Americans came into the war but to use area bombing, nighttime area bombing, because they just didn't have the accuracy or the fighter protection, accompanying fighter protection, to wage a pinpoint strategic strike against German industry, military industry. So you might say they made a virtue out of necessity. And what happened, actually, how this started, was an errant German bombing raid on part of London.
No, the London docks. The London docks, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
Yeah.
It was really an errant strike. And Churchill, if you read some of the declassified notes of the War Cabinet, he said, okay, we've got the excuse now to engage in this, in what Arthur Bomber Harris wants to do. And the Germans kept saying it was a mistake. They didn't mean to do it. I mean, it was bizarre, surreal when you look back at the communication that was being made by the Germans. And that's all the British needed.
Is it in fact clear that
very
it was
clear
a mistake?
That Churchill saw this?
No, not Churchill. Was it in fact clear that the Germans did not mean to attack?
No, it was an errant bombing raid. It was an errant bombing raid that just went off course, which was typical at the time. And
but Churchill understood this
very well.
But he chose to make the fullest possible use of this supposed mistake.
Look, there were other instances.
Whether it was or not, I'm not saying now that I know for a fact, but let's say it was. But he decided we must take advantage of this, and we must prosecute the war. To quote the Germans, total war. We must prosecute the war.
Totalkrieg.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
We must prosecute the war in any way, by all means, because there is only one thing that counts in the final analysis, and that is victory.
Total war. Totalkrieg. There were bizarre instances that happened during this whole bombing campaign. One worth mentioning, where there was a ship in Hamburg that was hit, and apparently it let off toxic gases. It was like a chlorine gas accident that happened. And the Germans were very, very clear in making a statement, public statement, that they knew that it was an accident by the British to hit this particular ship in harbor, and that no retaliation would happen. Why did they do this? Because they were afraid that if the British realized there had been basically a gas attack, that they would expect the Germans to retaliate in kind. And so they would be encouraged, the British would be inclined or encouraged to hit first with gas to preempt a German strike. Very complicated logic, but both sides understood that there was a limit. There was a limit, even in World War II, in the era of total war. Nobody wanted to go to gas, except, of course, for our people in the gas chambers. So even in the midst of the area bombing, there were bizarre limits to what happened. There were even limits, for example, Oxford and Cambridge were not hit by the Germans in exchange for Heidelberg and Tübingen, the respective university cities of Germany and England. Well, I remember my father saying right after the war in 1946, he was amazed. You went from the East End in London to Oxford and Cambridge, and you were forgiven for thinking there was no war because there was nothing hit, as opposed to the East End that was basically blitzed. And the same could be said for Germany.
There were still piles of rubble. So I have heard from people who lived in London at that time in the early 60s.
Correct.
There were still not insignificant areas of London that were piles of rubble.
Correct. And same in Germany. But later, starting in the 60s and then later in the 70s and 80s, things started getting woke. And what happened was the rules of war concerning illegal combatants suddenly changed. It was because...
First, perhaps define the term illegal combatant.
An illegal combatant is somebody who is not wearing a military uniform and fighting in an organized army. It's the classic guerrilla who either blends into a civilian population in the cities or into the jungle or woods out in the countryside. Why did this change start? Simple reason. Some people's terrorists are other people's freedom fighters. That was the simple reason. It became morally ambiguous because society basically had lost its North Star. Society had lost its ability to distinguish between justice and injustice, between right and wrong.
In other words, it's part of postmodernism and moral relativism.
Correct. Exactly. So now, for example, when I was in the Navy doing counterterrorism work back in the late 70s and early 80s, I asked a very naive question, I thought, which was, why don't we just go kill these people? Because we had targeted assassinations, but nobody liked to talk.
To be clear, about whom are we speaking? Which people?
The United States, I'm sorry.
No,
and
but
later,
which people? To target whom?
Terrorists, both domestic as well as international, right? So everything was more or less sotto voce, very quiet. It was done as long as it wasn't too messy and it didn't generate a lot of media attention. And I was told, quite frankly, that the rules have changed. In general, the rules have changed. So yes, you can have a terrorist, but now he has to be given all of the privileges of a court and a legal defense. And I said, why? Under the Hague and the Geneva Conventions, I can personally execute this guy on whatever field of battle there is, whether it's downtown or in the countryside. And no, you can't do that anymore. There's a thing called, humanitarian war right now. And I said, what the hell is it? Sounds like...
On what was this based?
It was this general... Michael Walzer, had a lot to do with this. These woke, ultra-liberal, ultra-left political philosophers who, again, brought up this whole issue of one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. So now, this is why we can't, here in Israel, when we capture a terrorist, just stabbed a bunch of people. Your natural inclination is just kill the guy, unless there's a reason, an intelligence reason for interrogating this guy. Just kill him right there. We can't. No, we can't do it anymore because under the new rules of international war or of war, they have to be treated more or less as civilian criminals, even though they're fighting a war.
This new philosophy, was it enunciated in written form? And if so, by whom? When?
100%.
How?
By international fora. dealing with revisions of the Hague and Geneva Conventions. I mean, it's in law now.
So they added
Like that.
extra new clauses and amendments to those.
Yeah, I mean, there's a
agreements?
whole new corpus of law dealing with humanitarian rules of war. And when you read them, you just say, what planet are these guys on? You can't wage a war this way.
So, in other words, what you are saying is that war became just one more criminal activity.
That's all.
You have bank robbers, and you
you have terrorists,
and you have
That's
rapists, and you have house burglars, and what have you.
Yeah,
and
you
people
have
who
these idiots
drive whilst under the
Right.
influence, and you have
Yeah.
people who decide, for whatever ideological reason or penchant, to stab people in the street or plant a bomb and blow up many people,
or invade another country and rape and dismember their civilian population. Yeah,
for example.
this is why there's an argument now, and I almost had a heart attack arguing this, that these guys that participated, these Hamas Nikim that participated in this cross-border genocidal attack against our southern communities, should be treated as war criminals. Now, there is such a thing. You keep hearing bandying around this whole notion of war crimes and war criminals. And this concept, this legal concept, is in humanitarian war is a direct result of that early transition from right and wrong to, well, we have to redefine what a war crime is. We have to, which really started in the First World War by German atrocities in Belgium, the burning of Louvain, for example, things like that. That's where it started. And what happened with the Japanese in China, the rape of Nanjing, for example, where the Japanese were they were like Hamas Nikim in China. They just did unspeakable things in Nanjing. That's why they call it the rape of Nanjing. And then throughout the rest of China. The Chinese understand very well what happened to us on October 7th, because their entire country was exposed to the similar type of action by the Imperial Japanese Army from the late 30s until the end of the war. Unspeakable crimes committed by the Imperial Japanese Army against the Chinese civilian population. Unspeakable. So this is where this whole notion of war crimes came up, and war criminals. And it was really formed around the Nuremberg trials, where you had this notion of crimes against humanity, right? And the notion that following orders was not acceptable. And that, combined with the notion of humanitarian war, morphed into what we have right now with the International Criminal Court. Now, do they have law to base their decisions on? Yeah. But the law can be defined or interpreted any way you want. The ICC,
as is well known, Henry Kissinger, Shem Roshaim Yelkov,
yeah,
a truly evil individual.
Truly.
Many years ago, decades ago, when he taught at Georgetown, he refused to give a course in international law. He was supposed to, but he refused to do so. This is quite well known. And when asked why he refused, and he passed this course on to some other professor to teach that course in international law. And when asked, why do you refuse to teach this class? He said, because I refuse to teach a class about something that does not exist.
Okay. There's a difference between academic responsibility to discuss something that is a fact, there is international law, and deciding not to teach about it because it's really observed more in the breach than in fact.
Well, that's obviously what he meant, yes.
Yeah, but okay. He actually could be considered a war criminal. Why? Because of what he did and didn't do during the slaughter in Bangladesh in 1970 by the Pakistani army. And that was in East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh. All the records are out now. And it was quite clear that Kissinger knew precisely what the Pakistani army was doing to the Bangladeshis at the time. It was genocide, no question about it. And in spite of that fact, because of realpolitik, he suppressed that information and backed the Pakistanis against the Indians, to the extent where he suggested, and it was implemented, that an American carrier battle group go into the Bay of Bengal just to cool the Indians off. So Kissinger himself is an exponent of a Roman belief, of which, okay, full disclosure, I'm also an adherent of, by Cicero, which went along the following lines. I won't bore you with the Latin. In times of war, the law is silent.
We can here in Israel today, we can only wish that were the case.
We can only wish. I remember very well, as a little boy, my father was attending a medical convention, believe it or not, in Hiroshima. And my father, well, those soldiers that had experienced the Pacific War during the Second World War, or the Pacific Campaign, which was a brutal racial war, were very different in their attitudes than my two uncles, who were doctors also, that were in the European theater. And everybody at this medical convention that was held at Hiroshima was asked to sign the guest book at the one church that had survived the nuclear bombing, the nuclear attack. And my father was enraged. And what he wrote in the guest book was words to the effect of, anybody who starts a war has no right to complain about how the intended victim ended. And that was something I was brought up with. If you start a war, an unprovoked war, the would-be victim, has every right in the world to do whatever he deems appropriate to win. And this is a concept which is actually...
Hang on, just 1 second. That's your philosophy. That was your father's philosophy.
Correct.
But that is not what is generally referred to today as international law.
So this gets back now to the notion of, what do you do with not just terrorists, but an army that embeds itself amidst civilians? The problem, particularly for us, is we're a small country that values our citizens' lives, or should value each and every one of our citizens. We don't have a very long time to fight a war either, because we have a popular army, a reserve army. So we don't have the time necessary for lengthy campaigns because of the economic consequences of keeping so many individuals out of the business, out of the economy. So if an army withdraws into a city filled with civilians, what are we supposed to do in that case? Well, I'll tell you what George Patton did during the Second World War. And I had one uncle attached to the Third Army, which was Patton's army. And this was in France, not Germany. The orders went out that if there were any German fire coming out of a village or a town, that entire village or town was to be wiped off the map, either by heavy bombers or heavy artillery, period. And that was in France. They were an ally of ours.
It should be pointed out that that is not in contravention of the Geneva Accord.
No,
It's
it
not.
is.
Most people are
now,
most people are certain that it is, and I'd like you to
but it isn't. No, no, no.
I'd like you to explain to our listeners and our viewers why this is not in any way in contravention of the Geneva Accords. Not that I'm claiming that I believe in those accords, but for the record.
For the record, it has to do with this very hazy, fuzzy notion of proportionality. Now, if you have a precision-guided munition and sufficient surveillance that you can pinpoint the location of an enemy position and take it out, well and good. And you didn't have that during the Second World War.
Nor do you have it today very frequently in combat situations.
It's very hazy now. Somebody shoots from inside of a building. In many cases, you don't know which window they're shooting out. So under the laws of dealing with proportionality, as long as you are aiming at a valid target and civilian casualties are incurred, not by design, but by proximity to the strike, it's accepted. So, for example, attacking a school filled with children because a sniper is on the side of the building shooting is not accepted. However, if the snipers are in the building and are shooting, you have the legal right to take out the building. And the students, well, there are people, for example, this is why this
that is clearly an inoperable set of regulations that cannot work in the real world.
Hold that thought. I asked a friend of mine who is down in Gaza right now. He had some time off, so he wasn't calling from inside Gaza. I said to him very carefully, do you still have legal people assigned to your unit? And he was quiet. And he said, yes. Only in Israel, where you have the concept of a legal commissar that accompanies the units down to tactical levels that can override, just like the Soviet commissars, the chain of command, where they will say to a commander, do not shoot at this building that you got fire from because you do not know if there are civilians in there. And
even though that is not what international law states.
Correct. But it's what just like the High Court under Aharon Barak, when he said everything was justiciable. Well, now it is filtered down to the military, where now you have a commissar, a legal commissar, telling a tactical commander, I have to think about the legality of what you're going to do. So you better not shoot at that building until I figure out whether we've done enough to ensure that there are no civilians in there. This is insane.
And some people
can't fight a war because in many instances.
Some people nevertheless insist that Aharon Barak, Shem Rashaim Yirkav, may the name of the wicked be wiped off the map. That some wish to nevertheless insist that he is not a dictator. Look what he has done to Israeli society.
He committed. I have to calm down now. He committed.
I'm sorry. I don't want to raise your blood pressure too much, but I can guarantee you mine too at this moment is rising.
He committed. And I said this in I won't mention the university that I addressed. I was asked to address a law class in a law school in Israel. And I walked in, nobody applauded me. Nobody. And my wife, Esther, Alea Shalom, looked at me and just kind of smiled at me mirthlessly, like, oh God, you're in for it now. So I asked a simple question. I said, how many of you know what Aharon Barak did when he became the president of the court. Nobody, I mean, they were waiting for me to put my head on the block. So I said, all right, let me explain what he did. He committed what I call a judicial coup d'etat. And he turned what was an imperfectly functioning democracy into a juristocracy. And I said, that concept, that terminology may be unknown to you because it's never happened before. Our country is no longer a democracy. It is a juristocracy.
And
And
that is
so
that is precisely what that extremely evil individual intended to happen. He intended that to be the case.
And that mentality filtered down into the army with the concept of the purity of arms, and now the attachment of legal advisors to our tactical units. It's a sickness. It's a poison, right?
Are you able to state for a fact that such a reality of legal commissars does not exist in any other army? For example,
No
the
other
American army.
They started to have it in the American army in Iraq, and that ended very quickly. The problem was
who ended it, and how did it end?
The army ended it. The army said point blank, you're not going to tell us that because there's a sniper in a minaret, the top of the minaret, that we're going to have to suffer casualties because he's in a protected area, a religiously protected area. That's a sniper up there. And this went back and forth. And the media had a lot to do with this. This one instance, there were 13 Marines killed in Ramadi by a sniper in a minaret, in a mosque complex, that the higher ups, this is a problem when commanders way back in Washington or in Qatar or in Kuwait, wherever they were able to see on the battlefield and intervene. Whereas before, tactical commanders had complete control over the action on the battlefield. Well, now you have these guys sitting in comfortable chairs saying, no, wait a second, don't hit this guy in the mosque because it's a protected zone. We don't want to piss the Muslims off.
And
well,
they
didn't count.
He's also
in this particular instance, they didn't count on a Marine tank showing up with a sergeant major in the command position saying he couldn't hear. He took the minaret out. When they got into the mosque, the attached mosque, shouldn't come as any surprise that the whole place was a bloody fortress, an armory. But CNN came straight in with the Marines, and there were a lot of dead ISIS, whatever you want to call them, proto-ISIS groups who were lying around. And then there was a slight cut, and you saw the Marines shooting all these guys that were on the ground that looked like they were dead, but they were finishing them off. That's how CNN put it. They didn't broadcast what they had, which was one of these buggers actually woke up and shot a Marine to death. They were faking death. So the Marines said, okay, you're going to play by those rules. And they went around and basically capped all of them on the ground to make sure. And here you have this element of the international media interfering with the conduct of war, legitimate war. During the Second World War, the media was part of the cause against fascism. They were a, if you will, a propaganda arm of the Allies. There were several major reporters who were well aware of the impending D-Day assault, and who of course kept their mouths shut. Why? Because it was the good guys against the bad guys. And now,
the concept of good and evil were concepts that were still generally understood.
the last war where there was good and evil clearly defined was Korea. Then Vietnam came, and everything blurred. And a lot of it had to do with the tendentiousness of the Pentagon with their inflated body counts, and they're lying about that the war was going to end, like with a victory right before Tet in 1968. Everything changed because of Vietnam. Everything. For us, for the Europeans, everything ended in Algeria in the late 50s and early 60s, where you had the media just turning into propagandists for the, as Frantz Fanon would say, the wretched of the earth. So
Okay,
Europe
stop. I'll stop. Let's stop there for one moment. The wretched of the earth, because this segues directly into our current situation with the supposed wretched of the earth in the Gaza, in the Gaza Strip. How do you think we should relate to these intellectual towers that have been built into the stratosphere by all kinds of jurists, which clearly prevent us from prosecuting such a war correctly and professionally and with a view to total victory? How do you think we should deal with our enemies?